Good night, America. It's time for your news by the numbers. Tonight's number is 450. More than 450 people in Florida have been ordered to surrender their guns since March. The handover began after the state law went into effect that let judges revoke weapons from people deemed a threat to themselves or to others. Under the law passed in the wake of the Parkland shooting, the state can file a risk protection petition against irresponsible gun owners in court. According to the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office, the majority of the risk prevention cases involved people with histories of mental illness who have threatened to hurt themselves. The measure signed by Florida Governor Rick Scott on March 9th additionally raised the minimum age of buying a rifle in Florida from 18 to 21 and established a waiting period and background checks for gun buyers. Now let's get into this. Florida has been one of those states where it is literally, my brother says it best, it's called the Gunshine state, where it's easy to get a weapon. Huffington Post a couple years ago did a study in Florida where they found it took one of their journalists 38 minutes to buy an AR-15, an assault weapon grade rifle. But sadly, because of Parkland, even Republicans have realized that the ideal of having guns fast and loose everywhere isn't the way to go. Here's what's interesting about this particular report is that since March 9th, that's less than 6 months ago, people, right? They have confiscated over 450 weapons. 450 folks in Florida should not have had access to a gun that we know of. And I guarantee that number is a lot bigger than just that 450. And as we sit here and reminisce on where we are as a society, I mean, there's a new documentary came out this week about Trayvon Martin and his untimely death at the hands of George Zimmerman. And just think about it. George Zimmerman, prior to shooting Trayvon Martin, America, was already under law enforcement watch for domestically abusing his girlfriend. But he was still allowed to have a weapon. If this law was in place prior to the day that Trayvon Martin decided that he wanted to go to 7-Eleven to buy Skittles and an iced tea, maybe, just maybe, George Zimmerman would have not been allowed to have a gun after beating his girlfriend to the point of no return. America, I am not anti-Second Amendment. Neither are most Democrats. All we're asking for is common sense rules of the road. And what Governor Rick Scott did, and I am not a fan of Rick Scott by any stretch or means of the imagination, but what Governor Rick Scott did in the state of Florida after the death of those 19 innocent individuals at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida in Broward County, was he had swift action. Now, don't get me wrong, this wasn't voluntary swift action. It required people going to the Capitol and protest. It required the students and victims of Parkland saying, we have had enough. We are not safe in our public schools. And because of that, Republicans finally decided to do something, because they do manage all the chambers in the Florida state legislature. So the point I'm making here is this. Why must it take so long to get laws like these passed, even though we know these laws are effective? 450 people shouldn't have had access to a gun, and those guns have been taken away. 450 people. Now, one of the sergeants of Pinellas County told ABC News that area officers have taken away about 200 firearms and around 30,000 rounds of ammunition since the law went into effect. Around a quarter of the 467 risk protection cases filed in Florida since March involved concealed license firearm holders whose license temporarily are suspended once the order was granted. And according to this report that we're talking about here, that emerged in the aftermath of Stoneman Douglas, which left 17 dead, the accused shooter engaged in threatening and troubling behavior way before they engage in the actual act of killing those innocent students. Very similar to the Trayvon Martin case, where George Zimmerman was already engaging in threatening and troubling behavior, but yet still was allowed to carry his weapon. Now, these laws are great, America, but these laws just don't go far enough. Because in Florida, you still have the Stand Your Ground law, which basically says anytime you feel threatened, you're allowed to You're allowed to shoot your firearm at whoever makes you feel threatened. That's how George Zimmerman was able to walk away from killing Trayvon Martin. Like I said at the beginning of this segment, I'm not against the Second Amendment. Both my father and brother are gun owners. All I'm asking for, and all Democrats are asking for, are some common sense rules of the road. How do we make a situation where there is a reasonable America? We're asking for reasonability. A reasonable standard that says you should have a gun and you should not have a gun. Every amendment in our Constitution has its limits. And the Second Amendment deserves those limits as well. Bravo to Rick Scott, and bravo, more importantly, to the students and their families who became vocal anti-gun activists after the shooting in Parkland. But let's remember this one thing, America. 17 kids in a high school shouldn't have to die before our lawmakers do what they need to do to make us safe. One of the top priorities of government is making sure that there's public safety.